Evan was a poor mechanic who lived on the edge of the capital city, surviving day to day by fixing broken engines and rusted transport carts. His hands were always stained with oil, and his clothes smelled of metal and smoke. One rainy evening, exhausted and hungry, Evan wandered into a grand hall where a royal banquet was being held. He had mistaken the place for a public shelter, unaware that emperors dined there. The guards were distracted, and no one stopped him as he sat at an empty table near the center. Silver plates, golden cups, and steaming dishes surrounded him, leaving him frozen in disbelief. Before he could stand and flee, the emperor himself entered the hall, followed by nobles and generals. At the emperor's side was a young woman in a wheelchair, silent and motionless, her eyes distant and cold. Whispers spread quickly as the emperor guided her to the table directly across from Evan. Evan lowered his head, expecting to be dragged away at any second, but the emperor raised a hand. "Leave him," the emperor said calmly, studying Evan with curiosity. Evan felt his heart pounding as he realized the paralyzed woman was the emperor's only daughter. The banquet continued in tense silence as Evan tried not to breathe too loudly. He noticed something strange about the wheelchair the princess sat in, its joints stiff and poorly aligned. Years of fixing broken machines had trained Evan's eyes to spot flaws instantly. Without thinking, he muttered under his breath that the support brace was positioned wrong. The emperor heard him and turned sharply, his voice cold as steel. "What did you say, mechanic?" he demanded. Evan trembled but spoke honestly, explaining how the chair restricted movement instead of supporting it. The hall fell silent as nobles stared in disbelief at his boldness. The emperor's anger slowly turned into cautious interest. He ordered Evan to examine the chair more closely. Kneeling beside the princess, Evan adjusted a single joint and loosened a locked hinge. The princess's fingers twitched for the first time in years. A gasp echoed through the hall as the emperor stood frozen in shock. Physicians rushed forward, arguing loudly, but the emperor silenced them with a glance. The princess's eyes shifted, focusing weakly on Evan, curiosity replacing emptiness. Evan explained that paralysis was not always permanent, sometimes worsened by mechanical restraint. He proposed building a new support frame designed to encourage movement rather than suppress it. The emperor hesitated, torn between hope and fear of disappointment. At last, he ordered Evan to be taken to the royal workshop under guard. For days and nights, Evan worked without rest, shaping metal with care and precision. He combined royal materials with techniques learned in forgotten alley workshops. When the device was complete, it looked simple but elegant, balanced and flexible. The princess was carefully placed into the new frame. Slowly, painfully, she lifted her arm, tears streaming down her face. The emperor fell to his knees, overcome by emotion he had buried for years. News of the miracle spread across the empire like wildfire. The poor mechanic, who sat at the wrong table, became the most spoken name in the capital. Evan refused wealth at first, asking only for tools and time to improve the design. The emperor granted him a title and resources, but Evan never forgot where he came from. He trained other mechanics, opening workshops for the poor and disabled. The princess practiced walking each day, falling often but always rising again. She laughed for the first time since childhood, a sound that changed the palace forever. Evan and the princess spoke often, sharing stories of hardship and resilience. Their bond grew from gratitude into something deeper and unspoken. The nobles who once mocked Evan now bowed their heads in respect. Years later, the empire was transformed by innovation and compassion. Mobility devices became common, and no child was hidden away in shame again. Evan stood beside the emperor as an equal, his hands still bearing oil stains. The princess, now able to walk on her own, addressed the people with strength and grace. She spoke of how salvation sometimes arrives in dirty clothes and humble silence. Evan looked back at the table where his life had changed, smiling softly. One wrong seat had led to the right destiny, and an empire learned that greatness can rise from the poorest hands. The empire believed the story was finished, but destiny rarely ends where people expect it to. As progress spread across the land, resistance grew quietly in shadows and whispers. Not everyone welcomed a poor mechanic who reshaped royal power and tradition. Old nobles who thrived on control feared the changes Evan represented. They gathered in hidden chambers, plotting to return the empire to its rigid past. The princess sensed this unrest long before it became visible. Years of silence had sharpened her ability to read people and tension. She noticed guards changing shifts too often and messengers avoiding direct routes. Evan, still focused on innovation, failed at first to see the danger forming. His workshop expanded rapidly, producing devices for veterans, laborers, and children alike. Each invention weakened the old hierarchy that thrived on weakness and dependence. The nobles began spreading rumors that Evan's machines were unsafe. They claimed the princess's recovery was staged, a political illusion. Crowds grew divided as fear crept into places once filled with hope. One evening, Evan was summoned to the palace under unusual secrecy. The corridors felt colder, the torches dimmer than he remembered. The emperor waited alone, his face heavy with years he could not escape. He warned Evan that a faction within the court planned to accuse him of treason. They argued that empowering the poor was destabilizing the empire. Evan listened quietly, his oil-stained hands clenched at his sides. He had never sought power, only solutions. The emperor offered protection in exchange for silence and restraint. Evan refused gently, stating that progress could not be paused once begun. This answer filled the chamber with a long, painful silence. The princess arrived moments later, standing firmly without assistance. Her presence alone disrupted the emperor's careful control of emotion. She declared she would stand with Evan publicly, no matter the cost. The emperor realized then that his daughter was no longer someone to be shielded. She was a force shaped by suffering and resilience. That night, banners were raised across the capital, announcing a public address. Citizens gathered in numbers unseen since the founding of the empire. Evan stood beside the princess on the grand balcony, heart pounding. She spoke not as royalty, but as someone who had known helplessness. She told the people that fear was the true enemy of progress. The nobles made their move during the speech. Accusations rang out, guards stepped forward, chaos threatened to erupt. Evan stepped ahead of the princess, instinctively, shielding her with his body. In that moment, the crowd saw clearly who he was. Not a schemer, not a traitor, but a man who protected without hesitation. The people surged forward, voices united in defense of the mechanic. The guards hesitated, torn between orders and the will of the masses. The emperor raised his hand, ending the standoff. He declared that the era of silent suffering was over. The traitorous nobles were stripped of power. Some fled, others were imprisoned, a few disappeared into history. Reform swept through the empire like a cleansing fire. Evan was offered the highest noble title ever granted to a commoner. He declined again, requesting instead a council of engineers and healers. The princess supported this vision, insisting progress required many voices. Together, they built institutions focused on restoration rather than punishment. Years passed, and the empire entered what historians would later call the Age of Renewal. Cities were redesigned to be accessible, work became possible for those once abandoned. Children born with limitations were no longer hidden or discarded. They were taught, trained, and valued. Evan traveled often, never staying in luxury for long. He preferred workshops filled with sparks and laughter. The princess ruled beside her father, her strength respected rather than doubted. Their bond deepened into partnership, shaped by trust and shared vision. One quiet evening, Evan returned to the banquet hall where it all began. The table remained untouched, preserved as a reminder of chance and choice. He sat there alone, not as a poor mechanic, but as a symbol of change. Yet in his heart, he remained the same man who only wanted to fix what was broken. The princess joined him, placing her hand gently over his. She thanked him not for saving her legs, but for giving her purpose. Evan smiled, understanding that destiny is not about rising above others. It is about lifting them with you. As the empire thrived, Evan knew challenges would never fully disappear. But he also knew something irreversible had occurred. The people had seen that power could come from humility, that wisdom could rise from grease-stained hands, and that sometimes sitting at the wrong table is how the world is truly changed. Peace never announces its departure, it simply fades while people are busy building comfort. Years after the age of renewal began, the empire stood stronger than ever, yet cracks formed beyond its borders. Neighboring kingdoms watched the transformation with envy and fear. They believed compassion had softened the empire, making it ripe for conquest. Messengers arrived daily carrying reports of armies gathering beyond the mountains. Evan read each report carefully, sensing a familiar pattern of misunderstanding. Strength, when misunderstood, often invites challenge. The emperor convened the High Council for the first time in years. Generals demanded preemptive strikes, nobles demanded fortified borders. Evan listened silently, his mind working like gears inside an engine. War machines had always been built to destroy, never to preserve. He proposed something radical, defensive systems designed to immobilize rather than kill. The room erupted with disbelief and mockery. How could an empire survive war without bloodshed? They asked. The princess rose to speak, her presence commanding silence. She reminded them that the empire's strength came from redefining limits. If bodies could be restored, then so could the meaning of victory. Reluctantly, the emperor allowed Evan to prepare his designs. Workshops across the empire transformed overnight. Engineers and artisans labored side by side. They built barriers that absorbed impact, vehicles that disabled engines without explosions, weapons that restrained rather than destroyed. Soldiers trained not just in combat, but in protection and recovery. When the first invasion came, it did not look like war. Enemy forces crossed the border expecting chaos and fear. Instead, they found their advance halted by unseen resistance. Bridges locked, wheels jammed, armor stiffened mid-charge. Soldiers fell without wounds, restrained by mechanisms they could not understand. Confusion spread faster than terror ever could. The invaders retreated, carrying stories that sounded like myths. Other kingdoms sent spies instead of armies. They returned with tales of cities without beggars, of veterans who worked instead of begged, of children with metal braces running through streets laughing. Fear slowly turned into curiosity. Delegations arrived seeking knowledge rather than surrender. Evan insisted on open exchange, not dominance. He believed isolation was the seed of conflict. Not everyone agreed. Within the empire, some generals feared losing relevance. They whispered that Evan's vision would leave them defenseless one day. One night, sabotage struck the central workshop. Machines were destroyed, blueprints burned, workers injured. Evan stood among the wreckage at dawn, grief heavy in his chest. He knew this attack came from within. The princess arrived before the guards, kneeling beside injured workers. She ordered immediate protection for all workshops. Then she did something unexpected. She demanded a public trial for the saboteurs instead of secret punishment. When the conspirators were revealed, they were not outsiders. They were decorated officers, heroes of past wars. Men who believed peace erased their purpose. During the trial, Evans spoke directly to them. He told them their skills were still needed, but their definition of honor was outdated. He invited them to help design defenses instead of destruction. Some scoffed, others broke down in silence. The emperor commuted their sentences to service rather than imprisonment, a choice that shocked the entire empire. Beyond the borders, tensions eased as trade replaced threat. The empire became a center of learning rather than fear. Foreign students arrived to study engineering and restoration. Evan traveled less now, his body carrying the weight of years. But his mind remained sharp, restless with ideas. One evening, as storms rolled across the capital, Evan collapsed in his workshop, exhaustion finally claiming him. Physicians rushed to his side, fear spreading quickly. The princess did not leave his bedside for days. She remembered the man who knelt beside her wheelchair years ago. The man who saw possibility where others saw permanence. When Evan awoke, his hair streaked with gray. He laughed softly, apologizing for worrying everyone. But he knew time was no longer endless. He began preparing others to lead, training young mechanics, engineers, and thinkers, teaching them not just how to build, but why. The emperor passed peacefully not long after. The princess ascended the throne without opposition. Her rule was firm yet compassionate, shaped by lived understanding. Evan refused all titles again, choosing the role of advisor, a voice that guided without commanding. Years later, as Evan walked slowly through the capital, he saw a world that once seemed impossible. Former enemies working together, children unafraid of difference, soldiers trained to protect life above victory. He knew the empire's greatest achievement was not technology. It was perspective. On his final visit to the banquet hall, Evan sat once more at the wrong table, now marked with a simple plaque instead of gold. It read nothing about power or rank, only a reminder that change begins with awareness. The queen joined him, no guards, no ceremony. They sat in silence, listening to the echoes of a past life. She thanked him for teaching her how to lead without fear. Evan replied that she had taught him how to hope without limits. As the sun set over the empire, Evan closed his eyes, content, knowing that even after he was gone, the world would continue fixing itself, one broken thing at a time.